Hey guys, Simon here taking my first look at some of the spoilers that are coming out of this pretty crazy debut weekend. My initial opinion on how Wizards of the Coast was handling the beginning of the spoiler season was mixed. Of course I felt disappointed when I saw only one card on display on their website, but it was because I was ignorant to what was really going on. Wizards really went all out on the theme of SOI, having actual players uncover secrets at events in order to unlock the new cards. It was all about these puzzles, meant to represent the mystery to be solved in SOI. As more and more people managed to figure it out, Wizards slowly unveiled new cards from the upcoming set. A really unique and clever way to get the whole community working towards a single goal. Good work, guys! Now, with all our puzzle-solving skills, what madness have we uncovered on Innistrad? Well, let's start with what we discovered at the Stitcher's Lab by the great people over at GP Melbourne. First, we have Brain in a Jar, a rare artifact which costs 2 generic to play. By tapping a single generic and Brain in a Jar, you put a charge counter on Brain in a Jar. Then you may cast an instant or sorcery card with converter mana cost equal to the number of charge counters on Brain in a Jar from your hand without paying its mana cost. For 3 generic mana and tapping the artifact, you may remove X charge counters from Brain in a Jar and scry for X. So right off the bat, this reminds me of Aether Vial but for spells. You don't get the passively stacking charge counters, but instead having them cost 1 generic mana per use. Its base mana cost is higher, but it also comes with the additional scry ability, should your hand be lacking in relevant spells. What really strikes me about this card is how the wording allows players to cast sorcery spells at instant speed, so long as you're able to tap and pay for Brain in a Jar's ability. This opens up a whole school of new ideas when it comes to spell deck archetypes, giving players a way to use powerful sorceries as a means of pulling off combat tricks. Although it's a really neat card with a cool concept, I just feel like it's a little too slow. It takes a decent amount of turns to build up those charge counters, especially if you want to use some of the more expensive spells out there. You also run into a problem when your hand's bereft of spells. Sure, you can scry for what you want, but that also removes the charge counters, so it limits your play options. Really, I see this as paying the mana forward. You're paying the mana now for a free spell in the future. It may have some yet unknown synergies, but for now, I just don't think it works efficiently. The reason why Aether Vial is so good is because you don't have to pay for those counters, and it grabs creatures, but for the added scry ability, which will cost you the counters, making Brain in a Jar relatively weaker anyways, it's just not worth it. Sure, this card may find some fun slot in a modern deck, but as I see it now, I don't expect the standard deck to be built around this thing. As in Limited, it's just too unreliable, other than just being a scry engine. Moving on, we have Pick the Brain, an uncommon sorcery spell at 2 generic and a single black. Target opponent reveals his or her hand. You choose a non-land card from it and exile that card. If you meet the Delirium requirement, which means you need to have 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, you can also search that player's graveyard, hand, and library for any number of cards with the same name as the exiled card. Exile those cards as well, then the player shuffles his or her library. So yeah, this spell is similar to a lot of different cards we've seen in the past. Duress and Memory Side come to mind. But how does it stack up? Duress allows you to do Pick the Brain standard effect for only a single mana, but misses out on the Delirium bonus at the extra mana cost. Memory Side costs 1 more, but bypasses both the Delirium and card in hand requirements. The thing I notice about these types of cards is that they're usually pretty high cost for what they do. On turn 3, if you look to cast Pick the Brain, you may not have the Delirium requirement active, making it an expensive Duress that exiles rather than discards. But if you wait until you get the 4 or more card types in your graveyard, it may be too late to even matter. Yet all this pales in comparison to the fact that you'll basically need to know what's in your opponent's hand prior to playing Pick the Brain. Even with Delirium active, if you play this spell blindly on your opponent's hand, you may end up exiling nothing worthwhile from their deck. Sure, getting rid of anything is a win, but it really feels bad if you have to exile a bunch of low-cost creatures. So, if you have some prior knowledge going in, and a means to peek at your opponent's hand, and a way to reliably get to the Delirium state quickly, Pick the Brain is great value. Most of the time though, you'll be seeing this as a 3-minute Duress. Next we have the Mythic Zombie Whore, Geralf's Masterpiece. It's a 7/7 flyer for 3 generic and double blue. Geralf's Masterpiece gets -1/-1 for each card in your hand. If you pay 3 generic and a single blue, discard 3 cards. Return Geralf's Masterpiece from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Now, I love this card, everything about it, from its flavor to its artwork and its card text. A lot of people may see this as a conditional 7/7 flyer for 5, but all the little negative things it does can actually be used to your benefit. Well, except the -1, -1 for each card in your hand, but hey look, you're trying to reduce your hand size here. The way I envision using this guy is in a self-milled Delirium deck, trying to get cards into my graveyard for tricks and to activate the Delirium of other cards. In that kind of deck, you'll probably have a rather small hand size anyway, so I don't see Geralf's Masterpiece ever coming out that low to begin with. But once he's good and dead, you can fetch him out with the active ability, adding more cards to your graveyard while also reducing your hand size. There's also synergies with Madness here. When a card with Madness is discarded, you can exile it and instead play it for its Madness cost, which is typically much lower. With Geralf's Masterpiece's ability, you can grab the Madness spells you need and play them at a reduced rate. He may not be the best card, especially in Constructed, but I think there's still some secrets to be unlocked in regards to Geralf's Masterpiece. As for Limited, whew, I think this card's great. And finally, we get a nod to the original Innistrad block with Aberrant Researcher / Perfected Form. It's a 3/2 flyer for 3 generic and a single blue. At the beginning of your upkeep, put the top card of your library into your graveyard. If it's an instant or sorcery card, transform Aberrant Researcher. It then becomes Perfected Form, a nice 5/4 with flying. So obviously this is a throwback to one of the most influential cards to come out of the original Innistrad block, Delver of Secrets. But how does this new version compare to its dominating older self? Well, not so favorably. The great thing about Delver of Secrets was that it was basically a 3/2 flyer for 1, since it was so easy to trigger its flip requirement. Now, not only was it easy to flip, but looking at the top card of your library was more informative than simply putting it into the graveyard. Sure, you can have a deck that revolves around graveyard stuff, but it's still more variable than simply looking at the top card. You can still mess with the library by using Scry to guarantee a flip, but with the Aberrant Researcher, the card has to go to the graveyard anyway for it to flip. At the end of the day, it's still a 5/4 flyer for 4, which is fine and all, but just a far cry from its Delver days. Anyway guys, that's gonna do it for this video. Let me know what you think about these spoiled cards for Shadows over Innistrad in the comments below. Are you excited to play with any of them? If you enjoyed the video and want to see more, consider liking and subbing the channel. It goes a long way in supporting future content. You can also support the channel by becoming a patron on Patreon and following me on other social media outlets. Find links to those in the description below. As always guys, thank you all so much for watching and I'll see you next time.